All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to convene the Tautog Management Board. Ask everyone who's here for that to take your seats. Any other sidebar conversations? Appreciate if you can keep them to a dull roar. Okay, I am Adam Nowalski. This is the Tautog Management Board. The agenda's been provided. We'll start out with the agenda itself. We are going to make a couple of changes to the agenda as it was presented. Essentially what we're going to do with agenda item 4, review the consistent management measures, is we're going to insert that to after the bullet point of review management options in item 5. The intention there is allow us to get started with discussion on the document, look at section 2, which is some of the overarching items such as goals and objectives, and then we can move into the meat, which is those management measures that we'll have a separate presentation for. So with that modification, is there acceptance of the agenda as modified? Seeing no objections, it will be modified and approved as such. Second item of business would be the approval of the proceedings from the January 2017 board meeting, I believe. We met in January. We started the last board meeting in January. Any objections to approving those proceedings as presented? Okay, seeing none, they stand approved. Next item of business is public comment for any items that are not on the agenda here today. I don't believe we had any sign-ups for that. Is there anyone in the audience that wants to speak on anything not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move ahead. Okay, so before we get into the presentation from staff on the draft amendment, just let me take a couple moments to kind of set the framework for what we're going to try to do today. First, I'll go through that we've got a 144-page document that most of us just got our first look at last week. So I understand that's a heavy lift. I want to extend my thanks to staff, Ashton, and everyone else for putting the document together. Everyone involved certainly been working very hard to get that document presented to us for our review here today. In terms of paths forward, Ashton's going to present the timeline. The initial presentation of that would contemplate us releasing the document for public hearings today, and then taking final action on that at the August meeting. As we go through the document, if there are substantive changes that people want to make, or if there are other options that they want to have reviewed by the TC, we would need to develop those specific tasks today, get them on record, have any preliminary discussion. We could potentially have the TC review those, bring a revised draft back to us in August for then final approval at the annual meeting, which should still provide for implementation for most states for the 2018 fishing year. So I just wanted to lay those couple of paths out there, and we'll get through as much as we can. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Ashton to begin the discussion of the document.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I definitely want to say a big thank you to the Tautog Technical Committee, Stock Assessment Subcommittee, and the PDT. This is a very meaty document. You know, going into 4 different regions, it's almost like creating 4 different amendments for each region. So we put a lot of thought into this, and look forward to your feedback today. So I want to go over the timeline for this document. So we're in the 3rd year of actually moving into this document and creating different management measures for Tautog. And this all started in 2015 with the benchmark stock assessment that evaluated the species across 3 regions. The board looked at that and saw that there was the stock was overfished, and overfishing was occurring in some cases, and directed the Tautog PDT to develop the public information document, which went out for public comment in September of 2015. And that kind of, it was very general, just are you in favor of regional management? Are you in favor of regional reference points, things to that nature. After that happened, the board then directed the PDT to develop draft amendment 1, which is presented to you today. But before that was fully developed, there was some changes in direction. So pretty much all of 2016 was spent reevaluating the stock status for Tautog across 4 regions. So there was a 3-region scenario, then there was 4 regions, and to do 4 regions, we had to do another benchmark stock assessment for the Long Island Sound and the New Jersey-New York Bight, which was presented last August. And then we were like, okay, there's been a significant amount of time that's lapsed between the first benchmark assessment, so we did a stock assessment update of all 4 regions, which included 2015 data for all 4 regions. With that, then the TC and the PDT worked on management measures. They were really just kind of, and they were presented in this February, they were kind of state-specific reductions. This is how much reduction needs to happen. These are the state-specific management measures of how you could achieve that reduction. But when the board was thinking about this at the February meeting, they decided we really want to move in more of a regional approach. So if the TC could go back and create regional options to the best of their abilities, then that should happen. And so that's what's being presented here today, and Jay will present that once we get to that section within the document. Okay, and then like Adam said, if the document is approved for public comment today, then public comment and public hearings will happen over the summer of this summer, and then it could be approved as early as August. So you guys should all have a handout in front of you that shows all of the options. There's 22 different issues and many different sub-options within each issue in front of you, and it provides an overview of what we're going to look at, as well as the pages within the amendment to where you can find the full text for each option. And this is just an overview of the presentation. So I'm going to review section 2.0. Then we're going to move into section 4.0, which really gets into the regional management measures, and this is where I'll present some of it, and then Jay will present the regional management options. That goes on for Long Island Sound, recreational and commercial. It goes on for New Jersey, New York Bight, recreational and commercial, because those are the 2 regions that have to take reductions. Delmarva, they're presenting regional options just because they thought they would like to propose regional options. Given this is an amendment, this is the time to do it, although they don't have to take specific reductions. Lastly, I will move into the last part of section 4.0, where we'll discuss the commercial quotas and the commercial harvest tagging program. So we will start with section 2.0. So as you guys know, this is draft amendment 1. So the goals in this document are from 1996. That's when the F&P was first implemented, and there's a lot of goals in there, A through E. And so when the PDT looked at this, they tried to pick out what are the main goals that we're trying to achieve for this species, and can we confine that into a revised goal statement, which is presented to you today. So, and this is really thinking about, since we had done all the management options, or the regional management options, that kind of helped guide this discussion. So it's the goal of Amendment 1 is to sustainably manage Tautog over the long term using regional differences in biology and fishery characteristics as the basis for management. Additionally, the amendment seeks to promote the conservation and enhancement of structured habitat to meet the needs of all stages of Tautog's life cycle. So we were really trying to hit on the regional aspect of this fishery, as well as how important habitat is for the life cycle of Tautog. For the objectives, now this goes into, everything that we really want to achieve for this species. And so originally the objectives were A through J, which was also a bit lengthy, and some of them overlapped. So the PDT presented ways that we can modify the objectives, and we went one by one. So that's why you see there's options B through G that specifically outlines how we modified each objective or eliminated that objective or combined objectives. There's also an option H at the very end that says, if you have read through all of these, then you can just approve all of the modifications that the PDT has made for these objectives. And the objectives include, we need to meet the F and SSB targets. We want to achieve regional management. It kind of discusses an objective to encourage EEZ management. As we know, there's not a federal F&P for this species, but it's kind of encouragement to hopefully achieve that one day in the future. Recognizing that habitat is important for this species, there's an objective as well there, and the importance of monitoring so we can continue to do stock assessments to manage this fishery appropriately, and then also acknowledging that there is an illegal harvest in this fishery and that we would like to diminish that as much as possible. That's a new objective that has been added. Next, we move into the biological reference points. So option A is status quo. Reference points can be modified via a management document. Usually it has been done via an addendum. Or option B says that reference points can be modified via board action. So the board can review the stock assessment and approve it for management and use and say that these are the new management, these are the new reference points that will be used for management. And there's a bit more text. So there's some text on here. There's a bit more text in the document as well. It basically says that the reference points would have to come from a peer-reviewed document. It couldn't just come out of nowhere. It would need to come from a TC recommended peer-reviewed document. For the fishing mortality target, right now the fishery has gone back and forth on how it wants to, on the target that it wants to meet. Most recently it's been 0.15, and that's equal to natural mortality. So that's how it originally started in this fishery. Then it was changed somewhere along the way, and now we've reverted back to that as well for the status quo. But now that we're proposing regional management, there's different F mortality targets for each region. And this actually gets at more of the timing of when would the board initiate a document and when would the board begin implementation of the document. So it's managing to the regional F. If the current F exceeds the regional threshold, meaning there's overfishing, the board must take corrective action via a management document, amendment or addendum, within some amount, an X year of receiving the overfishing stock status. So right now there's no time requirement. As you saw when I presented this timeline, this whole entire thing started in 2015. We're still in 2017 discussing whether or not, or how we want to move forward. This would say that board action would be within 1 year. Or the sub-option is B2, board action within 1 year, and then implementation the following year. Sub-option B3 is board action within 2 years and implementation the following year. So it's just kind of constraining so the board knows when they need to make management decisions and how quickly this process needs to move forward. There's also the probability of achieving F target in this document. So right now there's no guidelines as to what the probability would be. And when Jay starts going over the regional management options, you'll see there's regional management options that meet a 50% probability of achieving F target in 2021. And there's regional management options that have a 70% probability. Clearly the 70% is more conservative measures. So there's options in here to kind of streamline this approach. If the board feels like one would be better than the other, then they can just kind of codify that in this document, and there wouldn't be so many options for the TC to evaluate, for the public comment to evaluate. This is really getting at, what is the board's level of risk with this species? What does the board feel comfortable doing as far as managing this species? And so we wanted to present options for the board to consider that would kind of codify that in the risk tolerance in this document. For the F reduction schedule, right now there's the time frame with which you have to initiate a harvest reduction management response is unclear. So the TC, and the board approved this, has used a 3-year time frame. So right now it says that the F must get back down to the target within 3 years. So the management measures that are presented today have a 2018 through 2021 timeline. And so if we take these management measures within this 3-year timeline, then we should meet the F target. That could also be codified within this document, so it doesn't have to be a point of long belabored discussion. The TC would just know this is what we need to achieve and start creating management measures after the board has approved them. So option B is the management measures must meet the regional F within 3 years. Option C is within 5 years. For a stock rebuilding schedule, the board very explicitly stated in, I believe it was February, that they do not want to move forward with a stock rebuilding schedule for this species, but they would like to have it as, of course, an adaptive management tool. So there's option B, stock rebuilding schedule can be developed via an addendum at some future time when the board designates it. Option C is the same thing. It can be developed via an addendum, but putting a time frame on it. When the addendum is created, the rebuilding schedule cannot exceed 10 years. So it kind of gives a little bit of guidance as to what the future PDT would have to work with if a stock rebuilding schedule was initiated. And that was based on initial discussions for the TC, just considering the life history and of the species. That's where the 10-year kind of came from, as well as what is kind of standard operating procedure for federal fisheries as well. So that's the end of section 2. Are there questions on the goals and objectives of this F&P?
Okay, so thank you, Ashton. So we're going to go through, we'll ask any questions. Again, we do not have to select any preferred options here today. The goal is to get this document out for public comment at some point, either this meeting or next. If there are requested changes to something, we can try to do those by consensus. If we don't have that, then we'll take motions and votes on those items. But we'll start with questions on those items that were presented by Ashton in Section 2. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first one. For Section 2.7.1, with the time frame for the board actions, when we talk about the board must take corrective action via a management document within a time frame, are we talking about initiating a management action or finalizing that management action in those sections? Understanding that it allows for an additional year for those measures to actually be put in place by the states.
So this was a point of discussion whenever we were putting this in. The language was, we wanted to make sure the language was correct and kind of speak to that. And maybe it wasn't done as clearly, but it says the board must take corrective action. The board must initiate corrective action within a year of receiving overfishing stock status, and then it must be implemented the following year.
Okay, so I would say we'd work to clarify that in saying that it's initiating those management actions for sub-options B2 and B3 in the document. Additional questions on Section 2? Any comments, things people would like to see changed in Section 2 before a document went out for public comment? Or are they comfortable with these? The one item that I will bring up So one of the things that staff's had to do a lot of work with is developing the options under the 50 and the 70% probabilities. When we started out this discussion, we had a number of different regions, we had a number of different probabilities. I think staff's been pretty consistent in their encouraging us as a board to try to minimize those options to as few as possible. Part of that being just clarity for the public's sake. So this item here, the second part of 2.7.1, options A, B, and C, status quo, 50% probability of achieving F target, 70% probability of achieving F target. When we get into the prospective measures with Jay's presentation, we have those developed for presentation, but it has been staff's ask for consideration about taking either of those out of the document, which would then take those range of measures out of the document in the next section. So I'll just ask, is the board willing to entertain any discussion about keeping both of those options in there, the 50 and the 70% probabilities, or is the desire to keep them in, keeping in mind we'll see those prospective measures if you want to hold off, but if you want to have any discussion about it now would be a good time to do so. Okay, seeing none, what we'll do next is I'll also ask if anybody were not specifically having a presentation related to any other sections in the document besides sections 2 and sections 4. There's a wealth of background information in section 1 primarily. There's a lot of additional information in other sections, monitoring and other items. I'll ask at any point during the day today if somebody has questions about one of those sections or suggestions for revisions before the comment goes out, to please jump in and make those suggestions as well with those other sections. So with that, we'll go on to the discussion regarding section 4 and a presentation from Jay.
I was going to start out with just the regional management, just the regional part, and then we'll move over to Jay. So one of the regional management is new for this species. So previously been managing Tautog on a coast-wide basis. So option A is status quo, coast-wide management. Option B is regional management. And this basically says the regional management options here is a 4-region scenario. That could change in the future if there's new data to suggest that, the region should change. Then the TC can evaluate that and bring new recommendations to the board, although that would require a new management document to change the regions for Tautog. So as they are listed now is the first region is Massachusetts-Rhode Island, the second one is Long Island Sound, the third one is New Jersey, New York Bight, and the fourth one is Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And all of the management options that Jay will review are based on this regional structure. If for some reason, I won't go there. So that's it. So that's the regional management option. There has been considerable discussions around the Long Island Sound boundary lines. The Law Enforcement Committee met earlier today to discuss it, and Jason will review their feedback at the very end of this presentation. So I just wanted to present to you the 2 options that we're presenting for Long Island Sound here today. Option B1, as you can see, it's also Long Island Sound option 5 up there, is the one we were originally proposing, which goes from, on the line, it's Long Island Sound is in red, and so it's Montauk Point, New York, north to Watch Hill, Rhode Island. And this includes how the stock assessment was done. So New York staff had to go through and clearly separate the data in MREP for Long Island Sound and New York South Shore part. And when I talked to the MREP folks, and I said, well, what is the Long Island Sound boundary? Let me just clarify that. What is the Long Island Sound boundary? And that needs to be a management option in this document. And so this is it. So it's the MREP data is, I think it's like Long Island Sound estuary. And so that's why it's Long Island Sound, and it includes Peconic Bay. And so this would be how the stock assessment was done. This is the fish that were included in the stock assessment. This second option, B2, is Long Island Sound according to the Cole Regs line. And so this goes from Orient Point, New York, over to, again, Watch Hill, Rhode Island. As you can see, it excludes Peconic Bay. That would now go into the New Jersey, New York Bight region. And the Long Island Sound, once again, is more restrictive management measures will be implemented in that area versus the New Jersey, New York Bight area. So that's one thing to always keep in mind. This could be a contentious line. So with that, we will move into the regional management options.
Okay, thank you, Ashton. So my name is Jason McNamee. I work for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. I've got a series of these options. This just gives you a look at, what the various conceptual options in the document look like by way of management in your state. There's a lot of them. I'll do my best to, Ashton did a great job trying to put them into forms that are kind of understandable, and I'll do my best to fumble my way through them. I'll look to Ashton to save me if I start messing anything up. But you'll see as we go through how they're broken up, and I'll do the best I can to explain them. Oops, I have to enable editing. Okay. So just to start off, you've heard this already a couple times. We've got overfishing occurring in 2 of our areas. That's Long Island Sound and in the New Jersey, New York Bight regions. In each case, what you're going to see is a set of recreational options. And in those recreational options, you're going to see 2 risk probabilities that we looked at. There's a 50% probability of achieving your F target, and then a 70% probability of achieving your F target. Same for the commercial in these 2 areas. Overfishing is not occurring in the Mass Rhode Island or the Delmarva regions, but there are still some options to take a look at, even though there was no requirement to take reductions. There was still interest from the board originally, and also amongst the technical committee, to take a look at some options, to see what consistency looks like in those regions. We thought that would be informative for the board. All right, so quick, we'll call them rules of engagement here. So you're going to see you've got recreational and commercial options. What we are asking is to not choose separate probabilities, risk probabilities, when doing this. You're going to see it gets confusing enough to keep track of everything, and in particular, the way the analyses are done wouldn't be the logic would not follow through if you chose different risk probabilities for the two different sectors. And so just to continue on here, this would be the way to go. So just be consistent across both of your selections on that. So there's a slide here that says methodology, but really I'm not gonna go into that. We don't have time, but even before we knew we didn't have time, I had gone through it last time we all met, and it's pretty standard stuff. It's the same types of things you've seen in summer flounder and black sea bass. Those same types of approaches. There are two differences though, and that is we've got some slot limit options in here. So those were done in two ways. The Long Island Sound version, Jacob, who is from the University of Connecticut, PhD student, was up here with me, if not last time, the time before. He did a nice analysis, based it on, it's part of his dissertation work actually, but his is based off the assessment. He does a nice job. That would take, we could sit here all day and talk our way through that, so we won't do that. But the technical committee did review it and appreciated the work and vetted the work. I also think the New Jersey, New York Bite, I know they have a slot limit option in there. I think their analysis is slightly different. Didn't use that modeling approach, used more of a standard approach to determine those. So I just wanted to make sure that's clear. Happy to try and answer any questions you have, but I didn't, there's not a lot of slides or any slides with equations or things like that, which you probably appreciate. Okay, so here's a legend for some of the stuff you're going to see in the following slides. So if you see this, the big box at the top there is this kind of, I'll call it gray. If you see that in the table, you'll know that that is a closed, no fishing period of time. And then you've got these shades of, I'm going to call it purple. The reason for the different colors are, if a bag limit changes or something like that. So you can see where that happens, the color will change, but basically any shade of purple means that that's a season that's open with a bag limit of some sort. So we're starting off, we're going north to south here, Massachusetts-Rhode Island. Again, no reductions are needed here, but we did put forward a couple of options, to look at what consistent regulations might look like. And so here's the structure you're going to see moving forward. We're going to have a table up front. In most cases, what you're looking at with the table is some of the changes that kind of move forward, not in a regional approach, but more in a standard approach, meaning each state just takes the reduction in the way that makes sense for that state alone. Here, it didn't matter for Rhode Island, so what you're looking at in the first row of option A, that's our status quo regulations. So Massachusetts and Rhode Island each have 16-inch minimum size. We have different seasons, different bag limits, and again, we don't need necessarily to take a reduction. We looked at one that matches up our seasons, and then Rhode Island is the one that has a split bag limit. Massachusetts has 3 fish all year, and so what we've done here is we've matched our seasons up. Massachusetts would implement a spawning closure, which Rhode Island has, and then Rhode Island would drop its fall bag limit from 6 down to 4, and that would be an increase for Massachusetts in the fall. And then there's a final option that just makes everything really consistent, 3 fish with matching seasons. And so this is the next type of table you're going to see for all of the subsequent stuff, and that is I think it was Alexi from the Delmarva region who had put together a table with these kind of shading, and it gives you a good visual look at the information, and so we carried that forward here. And so the A, again, that represents for the Mass Rhode Island region. That's our status quo measures. That's what it looks like. And so you can see Massachusetts is open all year at 3 fish. So it's purple across the whole row with the 3 there designating that bag limit. Rhode Island has 2 seasons with a spawning closure. And so you can see that there as well. And then part of the season we have 3 fish, and then the tail end of the season we have 6 fish. And so that's what that option A looks like in our little colored version here. And then the next 2 rows show those consistent regional approaches. All right, so now we're going to jump into Long Island Sound. Here, overfishing is occurring. Because we still have both a 50% and a 70% probability of achieving the F target on the table. The range of needed reduction goes from 47.2% up to 52.6%. Here is the recreational measures for Long Island Sound. So in this case, in this table, what you're seeing is a standalone set of options. It says status quo, but that's a trick. It's not really status quo. It's just using status quo idea of just taking the reductions within your state without consideration for the other members of the region. And that's what this table represents. So you can see Connecticut has a 17-inch fish. They've got a two different periods with different bag limits, 1 period with 1 fish, 1 period with 2 fish. You can see the seasons there. So that 1 fish bag limit period is broken up into 2, and then they've got that fall season at 2 fish. That first one there achieves a 48.1% harvest reduction, and this is the option with the 50% probability of meeting the target. For New York, same type of information. They have a 16-inch fish. They have 1 fish possession limit in this option, and 1 season that basically is only in the fall. Option 2, same idea, but in this case to meet the 70% reduction. So that's kind of the standalone state-by-state version of the options. Here is an attempt at trying to implement some ability to be a little more regional, and so the idea here was just to get the options as close to each other as possible. Because of the magnitude of the restrictions here, we weren't able to sync up completely like you saw for Mass and Rhode Island. And so I'll just walk you across the top one there. So again, we're still in recreational measures. You've got in the first 3 rows, you have a 50% probability of meeting your F target. The bottom 3 rows is a 70% probability. And let's take option B1. As you walk across there, you have Connecticut and New York. They would sync up with a 16-inch fish and a 1 fish bag limit. And then Connecticut would have a spring season in the month of April. Then they'd have a spawning closure, a really long spawning closure, and then they'd open back up in mid-October through about mid-December. And then the New York version of that, again, not able to shoehorn in that spring season, so they would open up at the beginning of October and extend through about mid-December. And so you can see, hopefully that makes sense. And then B2 and B3 are just different versions, just to give you a sense of if you go up in minimum size, you can get a little bit more of a season, in particular in Connecticut, and you can up that bag limit to another fish. And the very last one there, not the very last one, but B3, what you see is that would be an option that syncs them up. That would be the only one that you could have consistent regulations, and that's what that looks like. And then the bottom B4, B5, B6, that represents same concept, but trying to meet that 70% probability of meeting the target. So I'll try to go a little quicker from here on out. I just wanted to make sure folks can follow along. Now what we're getting into is a set of commercial measures. Again, here is the options where we're just operating in a state-by-state version, taking the needed reductions. And so there is a minimum size, bag limit, and open season. One note I'll make here is there was not a lot of information to work with for the commercial fisheries. And so we're doing a lot of borrowing of information from the recreational fishery from MRIP and applying it over. And so just keep that in mind. That's one of the reasons, as I mentioned, it would be problematic to choose different risk probabilities, because there's a lot of conflation between how the methods were calculated. So you have status quo to meet the 50% probability of reaching your target is A1, and A2 is to meet that 70% probability. Here is the more regional approach. And so nuance on this slide is you've got under the 50% probability, what you have is a quota. And so in Connecticut, you'd have a 2,700 pound quota and then a 39,000 pound quota for New York. So that would, instead of trying to manage it like we do the recreational fishery, turning the dials of size, bag, and season here, you'd put in a quota to manage that fishery. Down below, under the 70% probabilities, you have both versions. So you've got a version that manages more like the recreational fishery, and then one that, again, manages with a quota to meet those targets. And you can see this was as good as they could do with trying to sync up the seasons. Okay, here you have Long Island Sound still, and now we're looking at recreational and commercial. Recreational on the top, commercial on the bottom, I think. Is that right, Ashton? Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. Thank you. So it would be the same for recreational and commercial. I'm sorry. So you're looking at the same different pieces of information of the same management in the top and bottom tables there. And so here you would have a 2-inch slot limit. So you'd get some level of reduction from the slot limit. And then these are the seasons and the bags that you could have in Connecticut and New York. Okay, moving on to the next region. Now we are in the New Jersey, New York Bight region. That's the outside of Long Island down through New Jersey. In this region, overfishing is occurring. It's not as severe as was the case in Long Island Sound. And so the needed reduction here, again, because we have a 50 and 70% probability of reaching the target, you can be anywhere from a 2% to 11% reduction needed. So this table, again, is your status quo state-by-state version of taking those needed reductions. The top table there shows what it looks like for a 2% reduction, and the bottom shows what it would look like for an 11% reduction. So you've got in New Jersey a bunch of different, at this time, several bag limits kind of switch through the season. In the New York Bight region, you've got a more consistent measure, 16-inch fish, 4-fish bag, and then that fall season again. Here's an attempt at providing some consistency between the regions. And so up on the top there, you've got single contiguous seasons. This is recreational, by the way. And so you can see each state would have a 4-fish bag, and the seasons do overlap, although the New Jersey season would be a little bit longer. And then the 70% probability is that set of 3 options down on the bottom. And you can see there are different size limits as well that are coming into these options. Here is a slot limit analysis for the same region, and this gives you a look at what those look like. You can see, for instance, in C2, you've got, you know, it kind of increases in consistency as you go down here, and just so folks are aware, C1 would get you a 2% reduction, C2 would be an 11% reduction, and then C3, where they're completely synced up, would actually be a little bit more, a 13% reduction. Here is the commercial side. You've got, again, New York Bight and New Jersey in the 2 variations, a 2% and an 11%. This is just looking state specifically how those reductions could be met. New Jersey does not have a possession limit noted. There is no possession limit. What they have is, I'll call it, you guys can correct me if you call it something else, but it's sort of a soft quota. They've got a backstop where when they get to a certain level of harvest, they would potentially stop their fishery or curtail their fishery in some way, but there is no bag limit for them at this time for the commercial sector. And then again, looking at the region here, what you can see is what they're attempting to do here is to implement that spawning closure. So that's why the seasons are split there. So they're trying to get at different variations where they take their closure, and that closure would occur during the spawning time for tautog. And then this is a variation that does a commercial slot limit, just like we had for recreational. Sorry if I neglected to say this here, the slot is a little bit larger. It's 3 inches, 15 to 18 inches. So part of the reduction is coming from that slot limit. And then C4 and C5 are different in that C4 meets that 2% reduction and C5 meets the 11% reduction. And you can see not a lot of variation there, a little bit more, a longer closure for New Jersey. Okay, we are now down the coast here in Delmarva. No reductions are needed here, but again, this region, some options were put together just to get a look at what consistent or as consistent as possible management would look like. So here are your current measures. These are status quo in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Maryland and Virginia have that 16-inch size, 15 inches in Delaware, and then there are different variations of bag limit and season combinations for the different states. This is what it looks like. This is not now any new scenario. This is just the visual representation of your status quo measures. And then here's a version that syncs everything up exactly. And so let me walk you through what each of them represent. Option B would actually be a liberalization by about 8.5%, so that would be an increase in harvest. C and D represent reductions. C would be an 11.9% reduction, and D would be an 11.6% reduction, pretty close to each other there. And that is the end of the management options. I'm going to flip to the next slide. I'm not sure if I'm exactly supposed to, but just to reiterate, I think Adam offered the question very overtly. I was going to do more of a Jedi mind trick kind of thing, but in any case, you know, it would be, you saw how convoluted, how many options there are here for this. A lot of that has to do with you've got 2 versions of risk. I guess, my personal opinion, not a statement from the technical committee. I don't know what kind of feedback on your risk policy you would get from public feedback. Maybe you think you will, but I offer, that it would cut down the many options that we just walked through if you were to select one of these 50% or 70% probability of reaching the target, rather than going out with two. I think trying to indicate that nuance to the public would be difficult. And with that, I will pause for any questions.
Okay, so Jay, you did a wonderful job. That took us through 20 pages of the document. That was impressive. So before I take questions, okay, I'm going to break just slightly from how we typically do this. What I'm going to do is I'm first going to turn to law enforcement, okay, who's got comments on boundary issues, enforcing regulations within a state where there's different regulations, consistency of state measures, to comment on some of those items. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these items, 4.1, and then each of the ones, 4.2, and then all of the sub-options in there, bring them up one at a time, and have questions and discussion about each of them as we go through, so we're not all trying to remember 20 pages back. So let me first turn to Captain Snellbaker. We'll get a law enforcement committee report on some of these options, and then we'll start getting into questions and discussion about how we want to move forward with the document for this section. Captain.
Thanks, Adam. So the memo dated March 28, 2017 is based on March 17th. The Law Enforcement Committee met to talk over the issues with the Long Island Sound. The Law Enforcement Committee members were briefed on the possibility of two sets of management measures for Tautog in the state of New York. A split would provide the different management measures between Long Island Sound and the ocean shore of Long Island. The LEC discussed a number of concerns and difficulties enforcing such a management plan. So I'm going to pull out some of the highlights of that discussion. So as far as defining a boundary line between areas, the Law Enforcement Committee had concerns where there was no clear markers or references. A boundary line over the water without clearly visible landmarks or demarcations is almost completely unenforceable. We also see an increase of accidental navigation in these areas. We prefer boundaries such as a coal regs demarcation line. From an enforcement standpoint too, we also have to do verification, e-navs, to make sure that the officers are in fact where they are, to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in court. That's a little more effort on our part. As far as enforcing different regulations in close proximity, the Law Enforcement Committee as a whole, we've seen a shift in anglers. Anglers will shift their efforts and go where there's more or less liberal regulations, which sometimes causes a problem with strict possession and enforcement. It's not always clear to people that the regulation applies. We apply the regulation where in fact that inspection occurs. Just creates a lot of confusion, and again, we do see a significant shift in fishing effort depending on where there's more fish to be caught because of the regulations are less restrictive. We also discussed the establishment of a buffer zone or a safe zone, as it was put. Such a zone would simply add to the confusion for the fishermen and enforcement officers on the water. We felt that a buffer zone would not provide any significant benefit. Would just add to confusion, and we also had concern of in that buffer zone, we'd hesitate to go check other people taking the resource, because you may run into a situation where there's a gregarious Tautog violation, and we wouldn't be able to enforce it because of the buffer zone. And like I said, it would inhibit us or prohibit us from potentially checking other types of people partaking in other fisheries. The Law Enforcement Committee strongly recommends consistent regulations amongst the states. The Law Enforcement Committee particularly stresses the importance of uniform size limits. Again, the issues, when somebody gets back to the dock, it makes the issues with size and bag limit less enforceable, because we don't really know where those fish were caught. With limited resources we have, it just makes enforcement very, very difficult. So again, we stress the consistency amongst the states. And also when it comes to commercial enforcement, remember, if we're at a market or an inland area, we don't know where those fish came from. So again, consistency makes our job a lot easier. We also had a discussion this morning. It was noted that option 5, I don't know if you have the map up there. We thought option 5 would be better for compliance for fishermen coming from Connecticut. I think we would get buy-in from our Connecticut fishermen. But at the same time, option 6 was a clear and concise boundary, which would actually be better for Rhode Island fishermen. Like I said before, we do like where there's a clear boundary. A coal regs demarcation line is actually on most GPS chart plotters, versus not having a clear definitive boundary where it just adds to confusion and less enforceability. That's all I have. If anybody had any questions, I'll be more than welcome to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Captain. So that takes us to questions and discussion. I'll just begin with first presenting the concerns of New York. As many of you know, there was a letter that was sent to the board reiterating some of New York's concerns with a lot of the items that are included in this section, including the demarcation line, including the separate regulations within the state. Staff was generous enough to devote some time to a phone call with myself, Jim Gilmore, Steve Hines, John Maniscalco from New York. As an outcome from that call was the sub-options for splitting the Long Island Sound line at the coal regs line. Additionally, what came out of it was some additional feedback from enforcement on that, as well as getting staff in touch with staff from New York in touch with ASMFC staff to answer some additional questions about the calculations. I'm sure Jim will have some more comment about that, but I just wanted to let the board know where we stood with that. So what I'll do, I'll ask staff to go back to the beginning of the Section 4 presentation. We're going to roll through each of the items here. Questions about them or any comments or modifications to these options. So the first item we've got is the regional boundaries, which presents two options: the coastwide management that we've used in the past, status quo if you will, as well as the new regional management with the 4 regions that this board previously agreed to utilize, and also incorporates the 2 options for dividing the New York Sound, Long Island Sound, and New York Bight areas. So questions for Jay, staff, or law enforcement, or comments, discussion on this section of the document? All right, seeing none, those options will remain in the document. Question from Mark? Nope, okay. So those options will remain in the document as they presently exist. Apparently you all got wind that we get lunch when we're done here. So I will tell you that the schedule said we're done at 12:30. I have had that negotiated to 12:45, so you're going to be stuck here for a little bit longer. So the next section is regional management measures, and we've got the options that were presented for both what was referred to in the document as status quo than with 50 and 70% reductions. Those don't apply for a couple of the regions. What I'd asked staff to do was to update the document. Instead of using the term status quo, which doesn't refer to status quo measures, but refers to the same mechanism of state-specific regulations that differ from neighboring states, to refer to that in the document as state-specific as opposed to status quo. So do we have any questions or discussion for the Mass Rhode Island proposed management measures that are in the document? Okay, seeing none, that section will remain as is with the modification from the status quo term to state specific. Section 4.2.3 is Long Island Sound, proposed recreational and commercial regulations, as well as the options for 50 and 70% reductions. Jay made another attempt to have some discussion about having only one of those in the document. I'm getting the sense we're fighting an uphill battle there. I think I'm ready to throw in the towel on that one unless somebody else feels otherwise. But let's go ahead and turn to questions and comments on this section. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. The first is the genesis of this amendment predates my time on the board, so pardon if I'm missing some information here, but how were the commercial quotas derived for Long Island Sound?
I'll turn to Jay for that.
So what I believe they did, or Jacob did, was just to take the average harvest that has been occurring under the commercial sector, and then last 3 years. So it was the average for the last 3 years, and then make the adjustment from that average harvest level.
Okay, I just want to comment that Connecticut took some very conservative management measure changes following the 2011 assessment. And I think we've been penalized for that, and I would appreciate an opportunity to maybe reconsider how those quotas were determined. The second, Katie, do you have a response to that?
Yes, I was going to say, I mean, there is, so the quota that is being proposed here under the commercial regulation section is basically based on how much of the cut the region needs to take to come down to the F target. So for the overall commercial side, there's a couple of, I mean, we're not saying these are set in stone, but there's a couple of things that you would have to consider, which is number one, do you want to split the reduction equally between the commercial and the recreational side? And our direction was, yes, we want the recreational to take the same % cut as the commercial does. So that limits how much the amount of fish you can actually take out in order to reach your F target, which is therefore that's the commercial quota that's shared between Connecticut and New York. Now that doesn't mean that you guys can't negotiate how much goes to Connecticut and how much goes to New York, but there is a limit on sort of the upper bound if you want to make that target and you want to keep the allocation between commercial and recreational the same. So that average of the 3 years was the amount that went into the projections to come to how much of a cut you need to take overall to meet your target by that time point. So there is kind of a upper limit on the amount of the quota that can be attributed to the commercial unless you want to make some of these allocation decisions here at the board level.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one more question.
Please go ahead, Mark.
Given the small quota that we have in Connecticut, our interest would be in maximizing the value of that quota. And given that there is a premium on small fish in the live market and there's a premium on large fish in the spawning population, was any consideration given to having a small minimum size, say 12 inches or something like that, in the commercial fishery, especially if we're going to be under quota management where a limited number of tags would be issued. I'm just wondering if something like that, the feasibility of something like that was discussed.
Jay, Katie, tag team?
So I guess the way I will answer is to say the closest we got to what you're interested in is that slot limit analysis, and so that does account for, in particular, because Jacob was using, you know, the stock assessment information and projecting from that, and so it is considering things like, you know, the yield loss from taking that smaller fish, but you know, to get all the way to 12 inches, we did not consider that, you know, in our analysis. And so were that to be something that the state of Connecticut or whoever wanted to see, we'd have to go back and redo those analyses, because it would cascade through all of the other metrics that we used. Keep in mind that even though it's commercial at this point, it's being managed very much like a recreational fishery, so we're operating in a lack of, you know, a lot of solid information.
Thank you.
And just also, Mark touched on a couple items, quota and tagging. We have those items for discussion after these sections as well. Next on the list, I had Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had two questions. One was the same question that Mark asked about quota, and my second question was relative to the tagging program, which you said will be discussed a little bit later, so I pass.
Okay, do I have any other questions, discussion on this? Mark, did you have any specific requests you wanted to ask the TC to review? Obviously, again, those tasks would result in delay of sending this document out for public comment. So was there anything you wanted to have jotted down here at this point?
Well, I wouldn't mind having the feasibility of a smaller possession limit in the commercial fishery under a quota situation examined, just to see if that's even possible, or how it would impact, you know, the magnitude of the quota.
Just a quick comment on that is that we're doing these, so the projections and these calculations are done in terms of number of fish, and then for a commercial quota translated into weight based on the average size of the fish in your fishery. So the number of fish will not change, although there's certainly considerations to be given to the fact that is how close 12 inches is to a mature fish versus 15 inches. But what would happen is the quota would probably go down because you'd be catching a smaller average fish. So if you multiply that through, the quota might come down. But understanding that it's also a market consideration, I think, is something we could look at.
Any other discussion on this section? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to New Jersey, New York Bite 4.2.4. Questions for Jay, Katie, law enforcement, discussion? Okay, seeing no hands up, we'll move on to the Delmarva region. I believe I saw a couple hands up for that, section 4.2.5. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A clarification and a question. Jake, do you have the options up for options B through D on there? Because they're different. What you showed on screen, the closed seasons for B and D are identical, yet in the document they're off by a month. Option D has a closure from June 1st through July 31st, while option B is May 1st through June 30th. So I'm just curious as to which is correct.
Sorry about that. So did mean to explain that. So the presentation is correct. What's in the document is not, and that was an oversight on my part. Alexi did send it where it was, the proposed spawning closures would be in May and June, and it just wasn't adjusted. It was kind of the status quo creeped back in, but now this is correct. All options have a May and June spawning closure in them.
May and June. And then the only second question I had there was just because I'm sure the question would come up in Delaware. If we go to a 16-inch Option D results in a reduction in landings. Do you know what the result would be if the closed season was 1 month instead of 2 months there? Is that something that could be calculated? I'm just curious because I'm pretty sure the question would come up.
So off the top of my head, I can't answer, I can't give you a number, but we can certainly calculate that, John.
Okay, so just to confirm, that change has been made in the electronic document, but wasn't in the document in the meeting materials. Okay. Any other questions or discussion about that section? So I'll give them a moment to discuss what they're doing here. Let me turn to Jim, just with regards to the letter from New York. You know, we had the call. Hopefully that was informative. You got some of the information you were looking for. I'll turn back to Tony here in just a moment. Understanding your position, New York's previous voting history, was there any other discussion or anything you wanted to have before the board with respect to the letter? I mean, we went through that section, didn't have any more comment here, so I'm assuming that you're okay with the options that we have in here, or at least as okay as you're going to be. But wanted to give you that opportunity, and just for the board's edification, let you know where we stand with having responded to the letter with the phone call.
Yeah, I think probably that's a way to characterize it as good as I'm going to be. I think I went from this started out as a headache, it's turning into a migraine, because now after I saw Jay's combinations with different percentages, and then remember, when you're looking at those regional things, that's within the region, and then again you get to that east end of Long Island, and now you've got the border between 2 regions, 3 states, 4 water bodies, and so I think the only thing I'll maybe summarize in the letter that we're very concerned about, and it was a summary of it, is like, you know, we can make this work on paper. That'll be great. And we'll all go home and pat ourselves on the back and say we got a great plan, but it's not going to work on the water. So I think the reality is that when you get to the east end of Long Island, and from the LEC report, is we're going to have what's probably the best way to characterize it, the least restrictive rule. Whatever the best set of limits are is what they're going to be fishing for, because law enforcement's going to throw their hands up and go, we can't figure out where they caught these fish. And just so you know, the courts in New York in particular are very, very supportive of fishermen over enforcement. A lot of cases just get thrown out with black and white, you know, arguments from law enforcement just because they just tend to side with the fishermen. So I just see a state where they're going to take the best set of limits they can get, and if they get a ticket, they're just going to get it defeated. So we're going to have to be able to analyze this based upon the least restrictive rule. So assume that if, say for argument's sake, it was a 15-inch size limit, and the longest seas, the highest bag limit, that's what everybody's going to be fishing. And I think we need to factor that into the landings, which gets to the last part. Then we're using MRIP. Now, we've been using MRIP for summer flounder, black sea bass, and we've been having headaches, and the sampling size is dramatically, you know, much larger than what we're going to be doing for black sea bass. So now we're taking MRIP, and we're about to do this again. We're going to take MRIP and extend it well past what it was designed to do to try to manage this fishery. So, as I said, I've gone from a headache to a migraine as I see this going forward. But I think what Ashton had said before, we have that option that when we get down the road that, you know, we can tweak these regions, make a new addendum to, or a new amendment to try to get regions that actually work. I just want to emphasize that because I think we're going there after we implement this thing. So at that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And just if your mic. Thanks. And if I understood Captain Snellbaker with regards to option 1 being the line from Montauk Lighthouse northward versus option 2 you're kind of on the fence with that because option 2 provides the benefit of the call regs line, but option 1 presents more of a obvious line for Connecticut fishermen, if I heard you correctly. So there's no clear winner out of those options from law enforcement.
That's correct, and it was mentioned that this is where, you know, public comment's going to weigh in heavily.
All right, so with that, I am going to close the book on the 4.2.4 discussion. Tony, you wanted to address something with the Delmarva discussion.
Actually, I have 2 clarifying questions, and one for the Delmarva. So it's my understanding that the May and June are spawning closures, and the board had asked for spawning closures to be included in these options. And so spawning closures, the way it's written out in the document as you read on further, those are sort of non-negotiable closures. So you asked for them to tell you what would mean to open up one of those months, but if it's a spawning closure, that would be problematic. So so for curiosity's sake, do you want them to run those at values for you, or?
No, that's all right. I don't know how closely it corresponds right now to when Tautog are actually spawning off of Delmarva, but anyhow, that I was just curious.
Well, Tony, let me ask you this. Is there more flexibility given to modify those if we don't specifically reference spawning closure in the document? I mean, are we hamstringing ourselves by using that term in that those then become fixed months of closure with no opportunity for modification and some equivalency? And are we better off just leaving those as closed months, possibly referencing spawning, but not specifically calling it a spawning closure?
So the spawning closures were based off of scientific information. We reference where we got it from in the document. I can't remember off the top of my head, but Katie might be able to tell me. She's looking at me like, yeah. But so yes, you are allowed to change those through the addendum process, but you are not allowed to change spawning closures through the conservation equivalency process because they were based on the scientific information. If you don't want to say your rationale is spawning closures, then you would need to change that direction. The more changes you're asking for, the more we will probably come back and tell you you're going to end up delaying this document for public comment, though. Because the document, there's several sections that are sort of tied to this being spawning closures in the way we've presented it to the public. My other question, because I'm not clear, is did Mark ask specifically for us to create an option in the documents for both the 50 and the 70% risk for a smaller size limit?
I was definitely going to come back to that one. Well, since you ended with that, I'll just go back. Mark, after what you heard from Katie, are you looking at something specific being changed there?
Actually, what I was thinking of doing, since I've heaped more work upon the TC, I thought I would throw you a bone and offer up an option that under section 2.7.1 that we eliminate option C, the 70% probability of achieving the F target from the analysis and from the document.
Okay, so let's try to deal with the Delmarva question then first on the spawning closure, and then we'll come back to that. So let me turn to Delmarva and their thoughts about, are you interested in removing the spawning closure references to gain the benefit of the flexibility of conservation equivalency? I got John Clark and Mike Luisi. John?
Yeah, I just brought that up just because I saw the reduction there, but if we explain it as the spawning closure, I don't think there's a problem there. It was just more of a, as I said, curiosity there, but given the explanation, we can leave it alone.
Mike?
I was going to suggest, thank you, Mr. Chairman, to be able to have a little flexibility is always nice. Specifically for Maryland, we currently have an open season during that time period, and the thoughts from our fishermen, they're suggesting that we do not, black sea bass opens on the 15th, I believe, of May. So there was a hope that any closure period would allow for the Tautog fishery to run up to the beginning of the black sea bass fishery. So there wasn't a 2-week period of time where the head boats that fish for both of those species would have nothing to fish for. So having a bit of flexibility to modify the dates, and I'm not suggesting we eliminate the first 15 days of May and not add into July. I mean, that's something that we might want to talk as a region about to make sure that we're not causing some problems with the business end of the charter head boat fleets.
Well, do you have a specific request for modifying the document? You know, you basically heard that if we keep all of the labels in as spawn enclosure and associated sections, it would likely be limiting in that flexibility. The option would be to modify the document to remove those specific references and labels as calling them that and giving you that flexibility. What's your pleasure? And if we get none, then the document will stay as is.
Well, then I'd suggest removing those labels. And I don't know if you can specifically do that just for our region, or would be you know, I'm not trying to cause any problems here. That's the last thing I want to do, is to create a problem that finds its way weaving through all the different regions and the entire plan. But I was just hoping for a little added flexibility. I'll look to you, Mr. Chairman, as to, I don't think it's going to be a big deal one way or the other, but I'm not trying to cause problems here.
No problem at all. I mean, from my perspective, this is 21 years in the making. Okay, this is Amendment 1 from the original FMP 1996. We've spent 3 years on it. You know, I made the comment on another species, but let's do it right. I think that's what the important thing is, as opposed to going back and saying, wow, we could have done this. Because then what do we wind up with? We spend another 2 or 3 meeting cycles going through some addendum process. So I'll turn to staff and get their thoughts on, are you clear on the request from the board? And my recommendation would be not just limit this to Delmarva, make it for all the regions that we have these proposed closures, but not specifically label them spawning closures, provide some reference to we're using spawning as guidelines for recommending these closing periods, but we're not specifically closing these times because of that. Is that enough direction? Tony?
It's enough direction, but I would ask the technical committee chair, these spawning closures in some of these areas are put in place because of the need for the stock to rebuild, and interrupting spawning has the potential to affect rebuilding. And so my question would be to the TC chair, for the areas that need rebuilding, by allowing us to alter the spawning closures to allow fishing to occur, how is that going to impact the rebuilding of the stock?
Jay, and specifically, I think I'd like to hear an answer with regards to any calculations that have been done, if they're going to be affected by that.
Yeah, so no calculations. You know, the way that I understand Tony's question is if you interrupt or impact a portion of the spawning period, you know, that's difficult to know. The spawning period does change year to year, not shockingly, meaning, you know, it might be a week earlier or a week later, that sort of thing. Could I offer one other thing, though, Mr. Chair? And it's just for consideration. I mean, when we were going through this, we were talking about spawning closures, but at no point was there ever really specific guidance. In other words, no one ever said, and we want you to capture 85% of all of the spawning that, you know, is in the scientific literature, or 50%, or we want you to bound, you know, the maximum peak by a month on each side. So we did the best we could to capture what looked to be the spawning period, going back, looking at ichthyoplankton data and egg data and stuff like that. But we were not working under very specific guidelines in that case. So my thought is, I wonder if there is already flexibility inherent in the fact that we didn't have a strong definition for spawning closure.
Well, I'll go one step further in that I think this board has made clear in past discussion today, development of this document, that spawning periods are clearly important. Any regulation that comes forward that's modified for conservation equivalency is ultimately going to have to be approved by this board. So this board's going to have that final say. And if a state brings forward a proposal that we look at and simply say, this conflicts with what our goals have been, our discussion has been, I think it would then be incumbent on the board to go back to the state and say, no, this doesn't work, and here's the reason why. So I think we have that backstop. I think it wouldn't be completely true to simply say if we took out the spawning closure designation that states could just freely open during spawning if they do so. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I appreciate those comments. I'll turn to Tony for one more comment on it.
That's fine, Adam. Then I think that if you guys are, or if the board is still stressing the importance of spawning and spawning closures as a tool, then, but you're okay with having them altered through conservation equivalency, then we can just remove that reference that you can alter spawning closures through conservation equivalency. And then that gives Maryland and Delaware the flexibility to alter their season closure through a conservation equivalency plan. Does that work?
I'm seeing a thumbs up from that side of the room and heads nodding. So I think the answer to your question is yes, that works. Okay, so where we are, just to frame up where we are, is we've got a number of other options to get through for section 4.3, but Mark Alexander brought up after seeing these options that he's now reconsidering, and I'll turn to him for your comments and potential motion about the 70% reduction options in the document.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I offer up that motion. I think that 50% is conservative and not unprecedented as a probability of achieving an F target like that. I know in particular in Long Island Sound, the harvest reduction that we're contemplating here is large with either of those two options. So based on that, I would like to offer a motion that Amendment 1 to the Tautog Fishery Management Plan consider only a 50% target of achieving F.
And I think that could be clear by saying in section 2.7.1, remove option C, the 70% probability.
Yes, sir, that's fine with me.
Okay, and a second by that by Jim Gilmore. And to be clear for the board, what that would then also do is that would remove all of the 70% reduction options, both recreational and commercial, across all the regions from the final document. Okay, let's try to get that up on the board, and then we'll have discussion. Do I have any discussion, any hands up for further discussion on it? Okay, I got one hand up. I'll turn to you in just a minute, Joe. Give me just a moment to sidebar. Okay, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess this question would be for maybe Jay or Katie. When we were looking at the reference points, and Long Island Sound decided to go with MSY reference points, is that, just recollection, were they more conservative than the SPR reference points that were being proposed? Do either of you recall?
For the Long Island Sound, the MSY reference points were very slightly less conservative than the SPR. They were almost indistinguishable for Long Island Sound. The big difference was in the Massachusetts-Rhode Island region, and we've already established, we already picked that option. But for the Long Island Sound region, there's practically no difference in terms of the numbers or the reduction that needed to be taken.
Okay, so the motion that's up on the board, motion to remove the 70% probability of achieving F target throughout the Amendment 1 document. That would, again, just to be clear, remove option C from 2.7.1 and then throughout section 4, remove all of those options. Any further discussion? Okay, I'll give you 15 seconds to caucus. Okay, time's up. For the motion before the board, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. Keep your hands up for another moment. All those opposed? Abstentions? Null votes. Motion carries by a vote of 7 to 3 to 0 to 0. Okay, so next we'll continue with Ashton's presentation for the remainder of section 4, and I believe your presentation covers all of the additional decision points that might need to be made. Ashton.
Okay, we will pick up again with the commercial quota. So the document doesn't mandate a commercial quota for any of the regions. It just says that a state may consider a commercial quota and kind of gives procedures within which to do that. So there's two different options. You could have a regional quota, and basically if any kind of quota decisions made moving forward would involve a regional working group among those states within the region to decide if it's state specific, how are you going to carve out the state specific quota within that larger region? If it's a regional quota, how are you going to allocate? Is it just each state gets a certain percentage of it, or is it just whenever the quota gets hit, then it's closed? Those are all decisions that would be made at a future set in time, a future point in time. This document just gives kind of a decision-making process, but doesn't say what needs to be done. But it does discuss quota rollovers and quota transfers and any quota overage within this one section. For the commercial harvest tagging program, option A is status quo, which is no tagging program. Option B would be to implement a commercial harvest tagging program whereby all states would have to be included in this program. De minimis status does not preclude a state from the requirements of the commercial harvest tagging program. It would be a single-use tag. The tag would include the year of issue, the state of issue, and a unique number that would be linked back to the permit holder. States would distribute the tags, and the cost for the tags would be whatever the state wanted to decide to be on the onus of them to decide if that would be the harvester bears the cost or the state. And it would be unlawful to sell or purchase commercially caught tautog, alive or dead, without a commercial tag. There is a sub-option within this within the tagging program, which is, and the LEC subcommittee has had significant discussion on this, which is when do you actually apply the tag to the fish? So right now there's two options in the document. Option A is harvester application would be at harvest or upon landing. And this was seen as a kind of a compromise. So the LEC would very much prefer that tautog is tagged immediately upon harvest. This really reduces any kind of loopholes or any kind of funny business as to where the fish goes and when the tags are applied. When we did commercial interviews with some fishermen, they discussed that there is a stress that occurs with some of these fish when you're catching the fish, and they didn't want to tag immediately upon harvesting the fish because they wanted to make sure the fish stays alive so that they can get the better price for the fish and kind of reduce any stress. So this option also allows the harvester to apply the tag upon landing the fish. Option B would be application by the dealer. So all commercially caught tautog would be tagged by a licensed dealer. This is not, so we had discussion about this. There is a lot more dealers in some cases than harvesters. I mean, not for every state, but in some cases, there's a lot more dealers. So this would be possibly a little bit more difficult to implement. So the tag would be applied to the fish immediately after the dealer buys the fish from the harvester. And then the rest of the commercial harvest, it is a long section, and it does go over, you know, what is the reporting process like. There would be an annual tag compliance report within there. When should the tag be given back? If there's extra tags, how they should be given back. So there is a lot of guidance within this commercial harvest tagging program, which is kind of just one lump section to really consider, and there's multiple subsections in there for you guys to review and to make sure that you're comfortable with all of the language in there. But in general, there is, I would say for a lot of this document, a lot of guidance to the states. There is a lot of flexibility for the states to then decide how they want to implement a program. Like right now, this doesn't say how the allocation of tags would be implemented. It does say that there is a quota that is presented in this document. The quota could be used to determine what the cap would be for the tags. So states wouldn't necessarily have to implement the quota, but the quota be used to derive the commercial tagging cap. And then states would then move forward to allocate the tags however they wanted. So we just had a lengthy discussion on spawning closures. So I'm just going to really quickly go through this. That at the regional working groups, there was a request for spawning closures to be included in this document. So when the TC prepared all of those options, they already had these very specific spawning closures within them. So the Massachusetts-Rhode Island and New Jersey-New York bite Tautog fisheries would be closed from June through July. The Long Island Sound would be closed from May through July, and the Delmarva region would be closed from May through June. But as was previously mentioned, that there is a request for, it says, the spawning closure intended to reduce disruption on Tautog pairing, protect spawning females in perpetuity, meaning that these spawning closures are kind of fixed in time unless an addendum has been created, as Tony went over. There is one sentence in here that says, the measure is not subject to conservation equivalency. We just heard that that is not the preference of the board, so we can just delete out that sentence. So this, if any state does want to kind of allow fishing during what would be termed a spawning closure, then that can be done. Those management measures will be brought before the board, and the board can decide if they want to move forward with that. So it could be done via conservation equivalency. We will remove that sentence from the document. And so this is very much linked to the spawning closure section. So in order to kind of say that spawning closures were exempt from the conservation equivalency program, we had to include very specific language in there. So this option can be completely removed from the document because we've heard that that is not the will of the board. So this would be just one less option in the document. It would only be 21 options. And the last part is this is not necessarily an option, but it is something that was discussed at the Law Enforcement Committee earlier this morning. Was that there's in addendum 6, there was inclusion of language about states need to really use possession when regulating Tautog, not the landing of Tautog. It needs to have possession. And so there was some PDT discussion about possibly including in federal waters a vessel's possession limit is respective to the home port. Jason can chime in here, and there was feedback on, well, what does home port mean? How do you define that? Do recreational fishermen really have a home port, or is that really more geared at commercial fishermen? So whether or not that this one sentence should stay in there, because that's an addition, is up for debate. It can be removed. I just wanted to very specifically let the board know that it was in there and to have a discussion about it, and we could remove it and just basically give guidance to the, it would be already what's in the document, but it could be explicitly stated that if you're fishing in federal waters, whenever you come in to land that fish, you will need to abide by the possession limit for the state in which you're landing. And that's already what fishermen should be doing, but it could just be more explicitly stated that that's what needs to be done. And some thought does need to be taken when fishing in federal waters. That's not just a free-for-all, and then so we're not sure where the fish goes when you land. There is a limit on the amount of fish you can take in federal waters, and that is the possession limit of the state waters in which you will land. So that can be adjusted. And that is it. That is all of the options in the document. See if you have any questions on the quotas or the commercial harvest tagging program. Please let me know.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashton. So we're going to go through this the same way we did the other sections. Is we'll hit on each of the 4.3 through 4.11 items, take any questions or discussion about those. So we'll go back to 4.3, the commercial quota. We've got the two options that are in the document right now, including elements of quota within region, rollover, transfer, and overages. Any questions or discussion about that section? Okay, seeing none, that will remain as is. The next item is section 4.4, which is the commercial harvest tagging program. Option A, the status quo of no tagging program. Option B would be to implement a harvest tagging program, and then with there we've got a handful of other items that would also include the options for tag application as well. So questions, discussion in this section. Dan McKiernan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is just a subtle issue, but I think the word landing might need to be clarified. If a fisherman brings in a holding car full of tautog and he puts it over the side of his boat, has he landed it? So I know, and I look at Jason, and this is always a sensitive issue for when you enforce some rule. And so I would ask that maybe we clarify that a little bit more if we can. But I don't want to delay this issue or the amendment.
And you'd be looking at that clarification in the title of option A for tag application 4.4.3, or was there?
Yes, that's right. When does one have to tag the fish upon landing?
So LEC is suggesting changing that to offloading? Captain?
It could be land or it could be offload, but you have to make a choice.
No doubt in Massachusetts we'll be enacting our regs for the Commonwealth, so we'll probably be clarifying it then, but I just want to point out that that's always an area of debate.
So is there any board objection to for 4.4.3 the harvester application option of the tag referencing offloading in lieu of landing? Okay, seeing no objection, we'll go that route. Captain?
Yeah, so I don't know what each individual state's definition of land is. In New Jersey, it's enter port. So from a New Jersey perspective, I'm okay with land, but not knowing the other definitions for land in the other states, then I would say, to answer your question, it would have to be prior to offloading if you don't have a definition for land, i.e. enter port. So I don't know if that needs more discussion or a clarification.
Does prior to offloading work in our state as well, where we have that definition?
Either one would work in New Jersey, but I'm not sure about the other states.
Okay, so I didn't see any objection to prior to offloading, so I think we'll go with that. Okay, that brings us to section 4.5, which has no options in it. 4.6 is spawning closures. What I would suggest we do here is just make this informational and not actually make these options here. Tony?
So Adam, from what we said before, that we were going to hold on to these, but they could be revised through conservation equivalency. But if you want to change that, then we can do that. Because these are, it's spawning closures that are based on the scientific information that's out there. And we would revise them through conservation equivalency to allow for flexibility and, how much percentage that you're capturing during a time period, or if the science shows that there's new spawning closures. But if you don't want us to have them at all, then we would just delete the section.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what's the benefit of having it in here as another option, another decision point? I think that's what I'm asking here at this point.
I guess it's based on the direction that we received from the working groups that were developing the management measures.
So I'll turn to the board. Our options here are to leave the two options, and boy, it gets hard when people bring food in front of us here. So our two options are to leave this section as is, but change the first paragraph to remove the line that says this measure is not subject to conservation equivalency. We would just strike that line. Or the other alternative is to just simply turn this into an informational paragraph. And I need direction from the board about which way they'd like to go. I'd love to see a hand. Eric Reed.
Yeah, I'm good with the informational paragraph.
Okay, we have a suggestion for informational paragraph. I have another thumbs up. Do I have any objection to just making that informational in nature? Okay, seeing none, 4.6 will reduce us to 20 decision points in the document and will become informational in nature. So I threw in the towel on some of this. That's great. All right, 4.7 was the last slide Ashton had put up, which referred to possession limit regulatory language. We've had a lot of discussion over time about complementary measures in federal waters. We have this line in the document highlighted: in federal waters, a vessel's possession limit is respective to the home port. So that brings up the question of definitions of home port. I believe the summer flounder plan goes into some detail about how this actually works. Let me first turn to staff to see if they have any thoughts after hearing from law enforcement about how best to proceed, and then I'll turn to the board about concerns about this. Ashton?
My initial thought after the very informative feedback this morning from the Law Enforcement Committee was to strike that sentence from the document and just kind of just reiterate that when you're in federal waters, you have to land according to the state's restrictions upon which you're landing, that there is some kind of cap that one should acknowledge when in federal waters, but to strike that sentence.
Is there any objection to striking the last sentence from 4.7? Go ahead, Captain.
Again, I think we all know there's no federal regulations for Tautog, which kind of makes enforcement difficult when you go to check a sea bass boat and all of a sudden there's a huge number of undersized blackfish, laying on the deck of the boat or in the hold or in a live bag, and there's nothing you can do from an enforcement perspective. I think the home port issue is really again reiterating that we do enforce strict possession. So if you're in the EZ, you may not be in violation of any state regulations, but wherever you come back and there is a regulation, that's the regulation that's going to be enforced. So to me, it's not a home port issue as much as it is a strict possession issue. I would also say that as far as home port's concerned, many boats are transient boats. Like I said before, most people will shift to where the regulations are more liberal, and you basically have a New Jersey or a New York or a Massachusetts or Rhode Island registration. It doesn't mean that's where you're going to be going back to. Also, as far as on the commercial end, we do have vessels that aren't documented vessels. They don't have a home port. They just have a state registration. So to me, this is more of an issue of, again, strict possession.
Thank you, Captain. Appreciate it. Eric?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the possession of federal waters is a different animal, but of course, if the harvester is actually going to be the one that tags the fish, they will have on board, I would hope, the tags of their point of sale. So then there's a lot of discussion in my mind, in my own head, about how many states tags can you have and all this other stuff, which we can, I suppose, work through public comment, but you know, I think you have to take that line out.
Peter Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a question and clarification for my own benefit. So I'm just want to make sure that this would allow state enforcement to enforce possession limits in federal waters, and is that correct?
Well, I think this section just highlights that the enforcement is going to occur where possession is, and couldn't actually occur until that vessel was in some state waters where some regulation applied. I think this section's highlighting the fact that right now there's no possession limit in federal waters, recreationally or commercially. So when a vessel is inspected in federal waters, no enforcement can occur because there's nothing to enforce, and enforcement isn't sure where that vessel's going to go back to. So I think it's an ongoing issue. I don't think we've clearly fixed it here, but I think it's something that we need to continue to work on moving forward. Follow up?
Yes, thanks for that clarification. And so I just, so this would not be a recommendation for any complementary federal regulations as far as this section is concerned, then?
I don't believe there's anything in this document that has specifically highlighted that.
One point of clarity, there is a section, it's later on and it's not an option because it's just carrying forward in the document. It was actually an addendum previously. It does recommend federal management and that the federal government, apply the minimum size and possession limits in federal waters. So that's just a recommendation.
And that was in section. Give us a minute to find it.
Four 4.15.
Okay, so thank you. So 4.15, recommendations to the Secretary for complementary action in federal jurisdictions. The ASMFC recommends the federal government promulgate all necessary regulations to implement compatible measures in the EEZ. Specifically, the Commission recommends that the Secretary fully implement regulations for Tautog in the EEZ that are in accordance with state minimum sizes, possession limits, closed seasons, and other possession requirements.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on that? Okay, so we're going, is there no objection to removing the last sentence from 4.7? Okay, and then the last item we have here is in section 4.11, we're removing that entire section, or we're leaving the paragraph but eliminating the options?
Yes, we're just eliminating the options. We'll still have a paragraph in there to describe the conservation equivalency for this plan.
Okay, so let me run down the list of modifications that we've discussed here today, and then I'll have two questions after that. One, throughout section 2.7.1, we'll use the term initiate, referring to the timeline for management document. Throughout section 4 in the options that reference status quo, we'll clarify that those are the state-specific options with the reductions. In the Delmarva options, the document was clarified with regards to May and June. We'll remove the spawning closure references there, or labeling them as such. In 4.4.3, we'll change the term landing to prior to offloading. section 4.6 will become informational in nature without an option. 4.7 will remove the last sentence. 4.11 will become an informational paragraph without an option. So those are the list of changes that I have. The two questions that I have is, first I'll turn to Mark from Connecticut with the, and then we also went ahead and moved to remove all of the 70% reduction options. So let me first turn to Connecticut. Moving to remove those 70% options, does that eliminate your need for any other measures to be evaluated by the TC and inserted in the document before you would vote for it going out for public comment?
No, I wish that to explore the possibility of a smaller minimum size in the commercial fishery under a tagging program.
Okay, so I think I heard that analysis could be done, but without a doubt that would certainly delay this to at least the next meeting. Do we have some level of confidence that we could get that analysis for our next board meeting? Mark?
Katie, is that something that could be considered under conservation equivalency?
Tony'd like to jump in on that.
I think Katie wants to add something after I'm done, but I think that if we can work with Jared to do the analysis to make it feasible, it can potentially could impact both the commercial and recreational, because I'm assuming we're holding the 50% reduction to the commercial, 50% reduction to the recreational. So you're just asking for, in that sense, but maybe Katie can clear that up for me. But if we can get Jared to do the analysis relatively quickly, then we can just add it as an additional option in the document. And however long it takes him to do that analysis, if it doesn't delay into our time frame that we have, there's very specific time frames that we have to have the document out before it goes out for public comment. If that fits into the schedule still, then we can bring you public comment back at the August meeting. If it doesn't fit into the schedule from how much time it takes him, then it would delay us.
And also, I think I would want to clarify, is this only for the Long Island Sound region, or are other states interested in, or other regions would want to see that lower size limit? I mean, I don't really want to open up that can of worms, but I also don't want to get here to be like, well, why did they get a 12-inch minimum size and we have to do a 16-inch minimum size?
Yeah, I guess they did open a can of worms. My interest was only for Long Island Sound, and I'm not even sure that New York is interested in it yet, but I would like to proceed with this in the most expeditious and simplest manner, though. I mean, if it's something that we could develop on our own as a conservation equivalent to the commercial option that's been submitted already, then there's no need to prolong the publication of the amendment.
Okay, so let me jump to my second question. And the Connecticut issue notwithstanding, all of the other changes we talked about could be made in a timely enough manner, maybe just sent the document around to everybody for 48 hours, or maybe not even necessary. I can review it and could go out.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I think if Mark wants to do conservation equivalency and he works it out with New York, because it is a regional approach, then we can do that.
Okay, so with the Connecticut issue, what I'm hearing is two potential paths forward. One, that this board would either have to agree by consensus without objection to have the additional item put in the document. Okay, and if couldn't be done by consensus or not without objection, then would need a motion from Connecticut, a second, and be voted on. Or what I'm hearing, the second path is that that option could be brought forward in the future for Connecticut's commercial fishery under conservation equivalency. How am I doing?
Good.
Mark?
Mr. Chair, I'll proceed with your second option there. Just
Okay,
make things
so
simple.
we've got recorded discussion of that, and that option would be considered, looked at under conservation equivalency, and wouldn't need further board action as an inclusion in the document. Okay, so at this point, is there any other discussion on the document? Okay, seeing none, what I would need is a motion to release the document for public comment with the changes made here today. I have a hand up from Emerson Hasbrook. Do I have a second? John Clark. Okay, while we're getting the maker and the seconder up, and I would just ask that you reflect that motion to include with the changes made here today. I'll quickly just ask, is there any public comment on this motion? Okay, seeing none, I'll come back to the board. You have 5 seconds to caucus. Okay, is there any objection to the motion? Okay, I've got an objection, so given an objection, I'm going to go ahead and ask for a show of hands then as a vote. All those in favor of the motion to approve draft amendment 1 for public comment as amended today, please raise your right hand. All those opposed? Abstentions? Null votes. Motion passes 7-0 to 2-1. One more digit and we'd have a zip code. Okay, are there any other items to come before the board today? All right, I thank everyone. Again, I have to extend a great deal of amount of thanks to staff for their work on this. I'll also ask, do you want to see a show of hands for states that want public hearings? Nope, not needed. I'm sure that'll get addressed. Mark? Okay. All right, having concluded the business of the agenda, we stand. Thank you, everybody.
Lunch is outside in the hallway for commissioners, please, and proxies. Please go and get your lunch, and we'll start the striped bass board in 15 to 20 minutes.